I am here with Dr. Jacob J. Andrews, who teaches philosophy, and he is going to teach us about scholasticism. Dr. Andrews, thank you so much for joining us. So my first question is, what is scholasticism?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So on one hand, defining scholasticism is a lot like trying to define analytic philosophy or feminist philosophy, these big things. It's not so much a clearly defined, here's a school of thought, here's what these people believe, as much as almost like a philosophical style. But we can talk about that and talk about what those tendencies are. So what that means is that on one hand, what a modern day follower of Thomas Aquinas thinks scholasticism essentially is, may be different from what a historian of medieval logic thinks is essential. I'm mainly a historical philosopher. I studied the history of philosophy, so I'm going to focus on scholasticism as a historical movement, as kind of a method of thinking rather than any particular sub-school. So basically, scholasticism is theology and philosophy and sort of intellectual life in general as practiced in the schools of the High Middle Ages. So schools is scholae in Latin. That's where scholasticism comes from. These schools are the cathedral schools, the early universities, kind of the beginning of higher education. So it's intellectual life is practiced in those institutions, and then its intellectual descendants up to the 21st century and probably beyond. This was the dominant method of doing theology and philosophy from about the 12th to about the 17th century. So to give just a broad sense of scope, the specific dates don't matter, but so Anselm of Canterbury is generally seen as like the first or one of the first scholastic thinkers. And on the other end, Francisco Suarez is considered, often called the last major scholastic. Anselm's first major book, the Monologion, was written in 1075. And Suarez's last major work, the Tractatus Quinque, was published posthumously in 1628. So you got 1075 to 1628. That's a huge range of time. And so, this isn't some, minor blip on the screen in the history of philosophy. It's a very long, very robust intellectual tradition that also stands right at the beginning of the modern era. So if you want to understand where Western philosophy comes from in general, where modern thought comes from, where academia comes from, it's very important to know something about scholasticism. So that's roughly what it is. It's philosophy practice in the early stages of higher education, and it's the descendants of that movement, especially up to about the 17th century, but continuing to a lesser degree today.
So when we say the word scholasticism, this time, it really does mean something about school.
Yes, totally.
Okay, mm-hmm. So that's helpful. And also you mentioned on the way something about bringing together philosophy and theology. Yes. And that sounds important to me. So can you help me understand what philosophy and theology have to do with scholasticism?
Yeah, so different cultures organize their educational system in different ways. And so one way to contrast this, I'm going to talk about this from a historical point of view, would be the way education was done in the descendants of the Eastern Roman Empire, so the Byzantine world and the Islamic world, and the descendants of the Western Roman Empire. So in the Eastern Roman Empire, that was where the money was. And there is a tendency for, and this is, by the way, I'm not an expert in Byzantine thought, and so I'm going to speak very generally here, but generally there was a lot of state-sponsored education in the Byzantine world. The idea of education as a training for political life, and then in the Islamic world, there's a lot of sort of private study of philosophical works, and also some state-sponsored stuff. In the West, education largely happened through the school, through the church, through churches and cathedrals, through monasteries, and eventually this evolved into the university system. And so from early on, there is a sense that theology and philosophy, kind of the human side of thinking and the revelation side, were very closely connected. So yeah, so when we'll talk about that in several of the questions, they're always seen as different, but they're never seen as something you can completely separate from one another. And that's a really important theme in scholastic thought.
You're using the word revelation. Does that have something to do with faith?
Yeah, thank you. So by revelation, what I mean is stuff that people learn through God, through religion. So typically someone would say, what in the Middle Ages, a scholastic thinker would say, well, anybody who's really smart and thinks it through can figure out that God exists, or that there's only one God. Again, that's more controversial today, but it's like, okay, there are things we can figure out things about natural science. But, again, most of these guys would tend to say, well, but to know that like God is a Trinity, or that Jesus is God's son, God has to come down and tell you that. You can't like figure it out by studying the universe. And so that's the idea of revelation. So yes, definitely connected with faith.
So revelation, God telling you, rather than you figuring it out on your own, aka reason?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay, interesting. So there's something going on when we're thinking about scholasticism that brings together philosophy / reason / thinking it through, and theology / revelation / being told by God.
Yeah, so you imagine if you're in one of those early cathedral or monastery schools, you're either a clergyman or learning from clergymen, and you might be reading, hey, Aristotle or such and such said these great things. How does this square up with the Bible, right? How does this square up with what the church says? And you might say, oh, these seem to go together. Isn't that interesting? Because this guy wasn't a Christian. Or you might say, oh, what Aristotle said here, that seems to contradict what the Bible says. What do we do with that? And that kind of clash between different traditions and attempts to reconcile them is really important to the history of scholasticism.
Okay, interesting. So you're hinting at some kind of like method, I guess, some kind of process by which the scholastics do whatever it is they do. Can you tell me more about the features of this method, scholastic method?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I'm going to explain it in a kind of sort of anachronistic way, but it's a way that I think kind of helps people, especially people who know a little bit about current philosophy. So one of the things I really like about scholasticism is I think in some ways it combines some of the best features of what today we would call analytic and continental philosophy, which is roughly philosophy practiced, the main dominant strand of philosophy in kind of the English-speaking world or the continental European world. And by the way, if that's not familiar terms to a viewer, they can follow this, that's fine. If it is, it will help organize the ideas. So, and I'm using these labels very loosely. So on the kind of analytic side, scholasticism really emphasizes logic. Logical rigor is huge. Right at the beginning of your training as a student, you would have intensive training in logic and also in what we would think of as semantics or philosophy of language. So learning to distinguish different senses and different uses of a word to interpret a text accurately. I read, I forget where now, but I remember reading once a writer saying that the battle cry of the scholastic is distinguo, which is Latin for I distinguish, I make a distinction, which is a way of saying that one of the most important tools in a scholastic thinker's toolbox is to show that a word in a text they're interpreting or a word that their opponent used in a debate actually can mean 2 different things or 5 different things. They say, well, if you take it in this way, you're right, but I meant it in this way, And so they're very into these fine distinctions between words and building up really complex, very logically strict arguments on that basis. And that focus on logic and language gave rise to one of the major genres of scholastic writing, and one that's probably familiar to anyone who took maybe a week of Aquinas in an intro philosophy course. So when this is called the disputed question. So suppose you open up Aquinas, his Summa Theologia, which is the one that everyone reads, and early on you find a heading, whether God exists. And you think, well, he's Catholic, so I think I can guess what he's going to say, right? And then you open it up, and the first thing you see is, it seems that God does not exist. You're like, wait a second, what's going on here? Is Aquinas an atheist? Well, no, but here's what's going on here. So in the actual classroom in the 13th, 14th century, often classroom discussion took the form of a debate. So it looks something like this. So the teacher would propose a question, say, does God exist? And half the class would be assigned to the pro position and half the class would be assigned to the anti position. And each group would present arguments for their side. They go through and each might give like 5 or 10 or 15 arguments. And then the teacher would listen to it all, kind of bring it all together, give his position, and then he had to go back and refute the arguments of the side that he disagreed with. So it was a very kind of, a lot like, think like a debate club in high school. It's a very organized style of debate. And this style of debate gave rise to this disputed question genre. And the most famous example of this is Aquinas Summa. You know, basically every topic he talks about, he starts by giving the position against what he thinks, then responding, and then replying to the opponent. The way to think about it, it's a very weird one for genre for a modern person to read, because it's not linear. It's not just point 1, point 2, point 3. You're kind of bouncing back and forth throughout the text as you go. The way to think about it is, it's basically a dialogue. It's not like Plato's dialogue, but it's a different way of writing a dialogue. You have two people talking back and forth with each other. And I find that it's a really neat way to teach intellectual fair-mindedness and kind of careful, open-minded thinking. You know, so think about, for Aquinas, the question of whether God exists was not controversial in the 13th century at all. It is today, but like, you know, nobody was seriously going to say, I don't think God exists. And partly there were obviously, unfortunately, political, social pressures there, but also just, it was something that they kind of thought was obvious. And still, Aquinas feels the need to really carefully consider arguments against this supposedly obvious view before giving his own position. And I just think that's a great way to train yourself to think in an open-minded way, to even consider positions that you know are wrong. So that's kind of your analytic side of scholasticism. Lots of logic, lots of careful use of language, and that leads to this very debate-centered kind of objection reply way of writing. Now the more continental side, and there's a couple things there. One is that there's a big picture focus. So you don't have scholastic writers, for the most part, who only work on philosophy of mind or ethics or political theory. They're all writing about everything. Actually, so the equivalent of a dissertation in the early period in the 13th century is you would write a commentary in a disputed question form often, but you would write a commentary on this book by a guy named Peter Lombard, The Sentences, which is basically a systematic, complete, like, Christian theology. So you couldn't focus on one, like on the sacraments or on the nature of God. You had to know about everything. I remember hearing, so this is like, I heard this from another scholar in a conference and I haven't looked it up, okay? But I remember hearing that at a very late stage, I want to say like early modern period in the Philippines, there were universities that used the scholastic method, and your final examination as a student is the teacher would take, he'd take a big book of all of Aquinas or all of Aristotle, and he would take a knife and just stick it in there. And wherever the page opened, you had to talk about that. So there's this idea that that everybody, no matter how detailed and logically rigorous you get, you're always also taking this big picture. There's also, I find in a lot of scholastic writers, an emphasis on lived experience, especially religious experience. So again, this will vary. There's often and sometimes very just accusation that scholastic thought gets very dry and kind of unconnected with daily experience. And sometimes that's true. I find in some of the best writers, there's always this connection with, okay, what does this have to do with the everyday religious life of the uneducated, poor, illiterate person down the street? And one work that I've worked on is, so William of Ocere, who lived a little bit before Aquinas. My dissertation is on his big theology book. He also wrote a commentary on the liturgy. And it's kind of taking his ideas and saying, okay, how does this apply to how we approach going to Mass and praying the Lord's Prayer and this kind of thing? So there's always this connection with like, how does this boil down to experience? So that's another kind of another side of scholasticism. And then the final kind of continental-ish point is that for a scholastic, intellectual inquiry begins with historical texts. So again, let's think about Aquinas, back on that question of God's existence. He gives his arguments against God, gives the arguments against God's existence. And then he says, on the contrary, it is said in the person of God, I am who I am. And that's Exodus 3:14 in the Bible, which is kind of funny, right? Because his response to the atheist is saying, God exists. Why? Because he says he does. And you're like, wait a second, that doesn't seem convincing. So does Aquinas think that this is a proof that God exists? Well, of course not. I mean, he knows that's not going to work. What's going on is this. So in this tradition, when you have a big question, you have a philosophical question, you don't start by saying, what do I think about this? You start by saying, well, what does Aristotle or Avicenna or Augustine or the Bible have to say about this? And then you situate yourself within that tradition. Now, notice that in that list of kind of random list of thinkers I gave, you've got a pagan, Aristotle, a Muslim, Avicenna, and a Christian, Augustine. So this isn't like a rigid, kind of dogmatism where you only read people that agree with your side. These authorities sometimes contradict themselves or otherwise in tension, and these scholastic writers are perfectly aware of that. But you always begin with the text. And this kind of instinct gives rise to another major genre of scholastic writing, which is commentary. So where you take, a book of the Bible or a book by Aristotle or something, and you go line by line and explain it. And this also came from the classroom. So, books were really expensive back then when people wrote on parchment. And so a student didn't necessarily have his own copy of every book. So often classroom looked like the teacher would take the book and read a paragraph, explain it, read another paragraph, explain it, so that the student would have access to the whole book. So that's another major type of scholastic writing, another sort of method they used, is going through a text and using that as the springboard for your thought.
So in general, you're telling us that scholasticism is a method whereby you study the different positions you might have before you argue in favor of the position that you think is correct. And this was a common practice. But in that practice, there's a huge value on history and what previous people have said. And you even mentioned the word dogmatism. So I'd like to ask you more about in what sense dogmatism is good or bad.
Yeah.
So like we're going to have a debate about something and we both begin by citing what some person a long time ago said. And so aren't we just doing feedback loops and echo chambers where we're just regurgitating what someone, how does that all fit in?
Yeah, well, I think that you just put in a nutshell really well, kind of that danger of a more tradition-focused way of thinking. And I think that's something that just because of the cultural moment we're in, it's pretty easy to see like, oh, here's why this is bad, right? And there are real problems with that. There can be this feedback thing where you only listen to people who are like you or texts that remind you of yourself, and you just kind of get your own ideas reinforced.
So how is it good then? So then argue that other side. Take us back.
Yeah. So there's a couple things there. One area of tradition of traditionalism, I guess you could say in scholastic thought, is that theology was really important. And for them, theology means the Bible and the church fathers and all of this stuff. And one positive result of that is that it kind of kept the more analytic side of the thought from losing the script in a sense, so it, like I said before, it, if you're doing this in a church context where you're a priest or you're a monk or a friar, and like, that the goal of your life is to know God and serve people and get to heaven, then that kind of automatically makes you think, okay, look, my little inquiry into the soul or into this, gnarly question is never going to be the meaning of my life. It's always going to connect to this larger view of kind of loving God and loving people. So that's one advantage. Also, that connection with kind of Christian dogma keeps scholasticism, I think, at its best, not always, but at its best, rooted in the spiritual lives of everyday people. So here's a counterexample. So Descartes, not a scholastic, although he uses scholastic concepts. He's concerned about global skepticism, right? And he comes up with the cogito. He says, well, I think, therefore I exist. And on the basis of that, he thinks that he can show that God exists, and therefore that his senses are reliable, and it all works out. That's awesome. It's brilliant. Here's the concern. Well, that's nice for Descartes. He has justified belief in God and in the world. But what about Descartes' grandma, who, I don't know, maybe can't read and never went to school and doesn't really, or the mom down the street who has 10 kids and doesn't have time to think about this stuff? What does it say about their intellectual and spiritual lives? And I find in scholasticism, the way they talk about faith is different, where they'll talk about those high level, what can we do with reason to prove this or that about Christianity? But the most important kind of, for the faith that counts as what they would call a virtue, is the faith that everyday Christians have. So I find that religious sort of kind of tradition-based focus keeps it focused on everyday experience rather than their own intellectual project. So that's one. That's two, I guess. Another one is back to the commentaries. So until several decades ago, scholars often ignored commentaries where they said, hey, you know what? This isn't real philosophical work. It's just a textual comment. I mean, how could you exhibit real creativity by commenting on someone else's work? Well, turns out you can. Because in a really good commentary, inevitably, you're going to get issues of interpretation, of internal contradictions with another writer, all that fun stuff that comes with anyone who's picked up a good piece of literature and read it closely. And that kind of thing really spurs philosophical creativity, because your thought is constantly being stretched and challenged and informed and transformed by some of the best minds in history. Also, human beings don't have the best memory, and we can't, I think often we get the idea that with each successive age of thought, we've kind of filtered out the junk in the last age and kept what's good. And sometimes we do that really well, and sometimes we forget stuff. And so that attitude of constantly going back and seeing what we've forgotten is really good. So the illustration I use for this in class is the movie Moana. Okay, so for those of you who've seen it, so Moana she's this, little girl living on this island with these people, and she's like the son of the chief, and she's gonna become the chief. She's living with these people who live on the island. They farm and they raise their chickens, and they never go too far out to sea because the sea's dangerous. We don't do that. And she feels this calling to go out there. And I'm gonna give away part of the movie, so sorry, but it's been out for a few years, so if that's okay. But and she feels this calling to go out in the sea, and it just keeps calling her, and it's like it's pushing her away from her people, and it seems like this very, like, in a sense, untraditional impulse. She wants to live a non-traditional life, but then she discovers that actually generations ago her people were seafarers, and they were explorers, and they spread all over these islands, and that was what they did. And then then something happened, kind of the world became evil and they retreated to their one island. So she thought she was being very untraditional. Actually, she was tapping into something that was deep in her history. And sometimes that text-focused, tradition-focused thinking can do that, where you're kind of rediscovering things that you've forgotten.
Dogmatism can be good then.
What's that?
So dogmatism can be good.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as it's a tool and it's an attitude, and it can be pushed in really unhealthy directions, and it can also be pushed in really good directions. So it all depends on, okay, it kind of depends on what your emphasis is, what your intellectual attitudes are.
Thank you. Okay, so Dr. Andrews, I'm curious because you keep mentioning some kind of tension between reason and faith. So if you can help me understand the tension between reason and faith in terms of how that's relevant to scholasticism.
Yeah. Well, this is one area where it's really important, where scholasticism is really important, because we talk about like religion and science, faith and reason kind of stuff today, and where those concepts are rooted in these medieval conversations. So here's a way to understand it. So nowadays, well, first I'll talk from more of a historical point of view, and then I'll talk about kind of how the issues cash out. So where this starts is really in the beginning of that school system with the cathedral schools and monks, and then eventually, as society becomes more urbanized, those grow into independent universities. So what happens is teachers and students form guilds, like trade associations, to kind of protect their rights. And the Latin for guild is universitas, and that could be a mason's guild, a stonecutters guild, a carpenter's guild. But that became our word university. So it's part of this growth of these schools. And one thing that happens in that process is that after the Crusades, there's an awareness that there's a lot of learning from the ancient world that's been preserved in the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. And people started to think, wow, we'd like to get our hands on that too. And so there's this movement to translate people like Aristotle or Galen, Ptolemy into Latin. So all of a sudden, there's all these new ideas and ideas from people who aren't Christians. So people are starting to think, well, hey, what do we do with this? We've got these people who don't have the same religion as us, but have some really neat things to say, but also maybe say some things we don't agree with. How do we process this? So that's kind of where that comes from historically. Now, in terms of how they fought through it, this is actually a great example of tension in the tradition. So there are kind of two streams here that sort of come together and clash and produce some really interesting ideas. So on one hand, there's a very pro-reason push, and this is very consistent throughout scholasticism. So this begins really even before the post-Crusade stuff with Anselm of Canterbury, who I mentioned is from the 11th century. So he died in 1109, is born in 1030, or sorry, I should say the other way around, 1033 to 1109. And what he was known for, what was original with him, is he would argue for fairly traditional Christian dogmatic positions on God and the Trinity and things like that. But he explicitly said that he was appealing to reason rather than religious authority. So rather than saying Augustine said this or the Bible said this, he said, hey, let's see what we can prove just using our minds. So on one hand, there's that. On the other hand, there's a very understandable worry about that. So there's a passage from Gregory the Great, who was a pope from kind of the late ancient, early medieval world, centuries before Anselm. And he had a comment in one of his sermons, and one of those, like, he kind of says it and it moves on, but it has a big impact. And he says, faith does not have merit if human reason puts it to the test, or belief does not have merit if human reason puts it to the test. So what he seems to be saying is, well, your belief in these Christian ideas is not meritorious. It doesn't count for your salvation if it's tested by reason. So that seems to, so the idea is basically this, so faith is seen as something that is really important to salvation. It has this kind of, it has a value beyond mere belief. And so, well, why is that? Well, one way of thinking through it is to say, well, it's because when you have faith, you trust God. You might not be able to tell if something's true for yourself, but you have this love for God where you trust that what he's telling you is true. And that seems to be, trust is a positive thing. So it kind of makes sense that that would be important to salvation. But hold on. If you know that something is true, you can't trust God for it. So it's kind of like, if someone tells me, hey, Dr. Andrews, it's what would be an easy thing, hey, you're in Carroll Stream, Illinois right now. I'm not going to be like, oh, I trust you. Or, hey, 1 + 1 is 2. And yeah, I trust you. I can't trust someone for that. I know it. And so, but then you think, well, oh no, if that makes it seem like proofs and reason make trust impossible, which means they might make faith impossible. So we don't know, what do we do about this? So we've got these two directions, two kind of tendencies in their thought. You've got this, hey, wow, God has given us this intellect where we can think through things and come up with reasons and argue with each other and learn new things about our faith. On the other hand, wait, but does that minimize the role of faith? And they're trying to think through, how do we have both at once? How do we be faithful Christians, but also explore thought, explore philosophy and religion to the greatest degree possible? So that's the sort of question they're trying to answer.
And why exactly did you mention Aristotle? Learning Aristotle has something to do with creating the tension between faith and reason, or what's Aristotle's role?
Yeah, because you can see by the dates on that card. I mean, Aristotle is 1,000 years or more before some of the people we're talking about. So what do you do with that? Well, over 1,000 years, yeah. So Aristotle, it goes back to this emphasis on text. So often you'll notice, if you read Aquinas or other writers, they'll just refer to Aristotle as the philosopher, rather than referring to him by name. He's the philosopher. Doesn't mean that there were other philosophers, but he's the philosopher. And the idea is that for them, Aristotle is the paradigmatic example of what human reason can achieve apart from divine revelation. You want to know what the human mind is capable of, you look at Aristotle. Dante, who is also part of the Scholastic world, called Aristotle the master of those who know. Yeah, I know, it's pretty extreme, right? And the idea is that, like, yeah, Aristotle, not that other people didn't improve on Aristotle or add things, but like he's the foundation. You want to know like what we're capable of intellectually, you look at Aristotle. And it also means that Aristotle's texts are the foundational, they're the foundation of the philosophical, reason-based side of scholastic thought and education. So I'll give you a few quick examples. First off, logic. So the logic that these writers use to make arguments is fundamentally that of Aristotle. So they mainly argue using syllogistic logic, which is logic that talks about classes of things. So if you've ever taken a logic course and done the thing with the Venn diagrams, Aristotle didn't use Venn diagrams, but that's Aristotle's logic. So arguments like, all humans are mortal and all Americans are human and therefore all Americans are mortal, right? Or all humans are mortal, no angels are mortal, so no angels are human. Those kinds of arguments. And that's generally the kind of logic that they use, and that's all from Aristotle. Also, Aristotle wrote a lot about what sometimes today we call term logic, which is that kind of philosophy of language focus on categorizing words. So the idea of categorizing things into substance or accident, the concrete things in the world versus their qualities. The idea of classifying things based on genus and species, that's all from Aristotle. So logic is a foundational one that they're primarily drawing on Aristotle. Also, a lot of concepts in physics and metaphysics. So there's the idea, just a grab bag of things that are important to these thinkers, the distinction between act and potency. So for instance, this cup, this glass is actually clear. Light is actually going through it, right? It is actually brittle, which means it has the potency to shatter into a million pieces if I drop it. What's another thing? This book does not have that potency. And it's not that one is actually broken and one isn't. It's just that this has the potential to break, to shatter. This doesn't. So there's the idea of act and potencies from Aristotle. The idea of matter and form. So to give a really rough example, again, glass, made of glass, that's its matter, but this glass could have been shaped into a little bird statue instead, but it wasn't. So the form is different. That's from Aristotle. Related to this, you get the idea that the soul is the form of the body. So the way a living organism is made of matter, but that matter is organized to fulfill certain functions, and that's the form. But then Aristotle says, well, what about the human soul? That seems to be this physical form too, but we have this intellectual side that doesn't seem to be reducible to a physical substrate. Basically, he thinks that concepts are not the kind of software you can put on physical brain hardware. And that raises a whole new sense of, wait a second, are we like is our soul like half physical and half not? What's going on here? So that's from Aristotle. Huge conversation about that between Christians, Muslims, different people. Great, really awesome stuff there. And then finally, in the area of ethics and human nature. So Aristotle has this idea that living a good life is all about developing and exercising certain virtues. So virtues, we talked about potency. Virtues are like enhancements on a potency. So for instance, give a silly example, a pair of scissors has the potential potency to cut paper, right? There you go. Now, if you were to take those scissors and sharpen them with a sharpening stone really, really well, you've enhanced that. In that sense, that's kind of, in a loose sense, the virtue of the scissors, that it cuts like really, really. You ever have those scissors where you can just like glide across the paper and it cuts it, like that. And human virtue, yeah, I know, I love it. Human virtue is things like courage or generosity, things that are like, we're not born with them, but we have the ability to discover, to develop them and enhance them. So virtue is important. But then you think, okay, we're developing these virtues. Where is this going? Okay, I can see how I'm good at being brave, or I'm good at doing this, I'm a good guitar player or a good plumber. Well, what does it mean to be a good person, right? And well, Aristotle's interesting there because he talks in different directions. Sometimes he says that the goal of life is practical or political virtue. It's having this excellent life in the context of society. Sometimes he says, actually, there's also this higher end, which has to do with contemplation, of like grasping kind of the structure of the universe, like kind of a scientific enlightenment, and then or understanding the highest causes of things and the ultimate kind of origin of everything. And then people pick up on this, Christians, pagans, Muslims say, well, that's interesting because the highest cause of things is God. So that sounds a lot like what we say in our religion, where our purpose is to contemplate God. So there's something where they're seeing Aristotle saying, well, he's not quite like we're used to hearing in Sunday school, but we can work with this. We can put these two traditions in dialogue and see what happens. So that's just a grab bag of areas where Aristotle is kind of providing foundational ideas and foundational like questions and difficulties in the tradition.
Interesting. So scholasticism talks about a lot of things, but on one hand, you've been clarifying for us what it is as a method, and you've name dropped people who have practiced the method well, and you've also added where the method had its origin, which is something like a response to making sense of the reason that they got from Aristotle and the faith that they had originally and the tension between those two things. So I feel like we've been all over the place. And to kind of bring us back, my last question will be this: why is the scholastic method important, or why should I know about scholasticism?
Yeah. So on one hand, there's the I think it helps from a historical point of view to understand the present. So you want to, so scholasticism is where academia begins. So if you're a college student, if you're a grad student, that helps you get a sense of like where this whole thing comes from that you're spending years of your life in. Also, you imagine, so this is going from the 11th, 12th century where, Europe is kind of recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire and building up to a new society, and not ends, but like it's kind of dominance ends in kind of the 17th century or so when the modern era is beginning. So this is also the beginning of modernity. So for instance, a lot of ideas we have about rights come from the definition of a person come from legal and ethical disputes in the Middle Ages. So it's important for understanding a lot of really foundational ideas that we all hold very dear today. And this is, I'm going to jump into real quickly into, I don't know a ton about this, but I, read a little bit, when Europeans come to the New World and they're encountering indigenous people and thinking, well, are these beings human? Because it'd be nice if they weren't, because we're bad people, but are they human? Well, it's theologians using scholastic concepts to say yes, because here's our definition of human going back to Aristotle, and here's how we're going to argue this out. So that was also, it was important in that kind of conversation, which is still really important today. So on a historical view, to understand where we are today, it's important. Also, in a general, more just intellectual view, I think exposure to scholasticism teaches good critical thinking. It gives training in looking at a question from all sides, considering objections, even to a position that you think is obvious. Also, it trains you to look at what other people have said and consider what they have to say before you speak. I really like how in your response to one of my questions, kind of combine those two, the disputed question and the commentary, to say, like, yeah, those both involve hearing different sides. Also, the focus on defining terms and saying, making sure you really understand what your words mean. Also, learning to, like, if you have a problem with what somebody else says, thinking, how can I interpret what they said in the most charitable way possible, or to give the strongest argument